Welcome, my friends, to the Swords of Africa. Today, we glance upon the weapons of the Congo. No, not the big Congo. I'm talking about this lovely little stretch of land known as the Republic of Congo. And since we're in one of the main homelands of the short-statured forest peoples of Central Africa, we're going to start this video off with a little something special. Oompa akka doompa dee dees. Inside the book we are all pygmies. Travel to Central Africa and live a moment of eureka. Who might you find in the dense Congo woods? Small people foraging for food and goods. How do they get all the victuals they need? Tools of iron that make, pray, bleed. Pumbaa hates the looks of this oompa akka shboompity shmar. Capitalist greed has gone too far. Chocolate harvesters are enslaved. When the flying fudge will black folks be saved? Alright, break it up, get back to work, damn it. I didn't bring you here so you could sing about a human rights violation. Excuse me. Now, follow me and envy my great wall of sheer annihilation. Come see swords that defy imagination. Now let me present to you all our first sword of the Congo, the Lipay saber of the Teke people. The Teke people can actually be found in both of the Congos, and even in Gabon. And of course this sort of thing happens often because African country lines were often drawn without the consideration of cultural boundaries. For the purposes of neatly organizing our map, we will mostly keep the Teke stuff within the borders of the Republic of Congo. Just remember that a lot of the Teke blades you'll be seeing today are also from the Democratic Republic of Congo. For instance, this Teke saber comes from Congo Brazzaville, while this other Teke saber was made in Congo Kinshasa. And before we start, I'd like to note that a lot of the academic sources that I'll be mentioning today are non-English sources that I had to translate, and that's because a lot of the English sources out there lack info about African weapons. From what I've read, the sword seems to have utility in both practical and ceremonial tasks. First, let's begin with the practical uses. Translations from the Collecties van het Nationaal Museum van Wereldculturen en het World Museum not only describe Teke sabers as weapons, but in addition to that, for some of the hooked Lipay in their collection, the description also mentions that the blade was used for forest pruning. Meanwhile, the Carlotta Museum calls these working knives for women, and that they were used when bottling palm wine. Now, as for their ceremonial purposes, I'd like to show you what I was working with here. If you use Google Books, you'll be familiar with the fact that sometimes Google lets you read a full book for free, but other times they don't let you read anything at all, and in some cases they only give you what's called the snippet view, which is a big pain in the ass. Here's a snippet I got out of De Veer Eert de Veert, which is a book that costs more than $100, so I settled for whatever info I could get for free. Because you can't highlight and copy text in snippet view, I have to individually type words that are both in a foreign language and in low resolution into Google Translate. Doesn't that sound like fun? The following snippet is what I got when searching the book for the word Lipay. It states, represent ancestors or spirits. The objects held in the right hand are swords, called Lipay in the Teo language, and Kitanasi in the Congo language. These swords, often with a beautiful finish, are found among almost all people speaking the Teo languages, Teke, Mefinu, Lalia, etc., or Congo languages, Congo, Woyo, Wum, Yombe, Bwende, Bembe, etc. Now, first thing I want to point out is that they just said that the Bembe used these swords. That's very important info for later in this video, and had I known that sooner, it'd have saved me quite a bit of research time. It also said that the Congo and Yombe, who I decided will be featured in a later video, also use the Lipay, so please keep all of that in mind. Now, here comes the frustrating part. That sentence at the start of the snippet is cut off, leaving us to guess what the subject was use in the sentence? Well, as far as I can deduce, the blank that represents ancestors or spirits likely refers to either masqueraders or figure sculptures, maybe even both. Now, for the most part, Teke sculptures are not equipped with weapons, but for evidence of Teke figure sculptures holding swords, we can look at this rare example where you can just barely see a carved sword poking out from the cloth in this old photo. According to the Met Museum, when a Teke sculpture like this one is holding a blade, said blade is an icon of a Bembe leader, so such a statue could be interpreted as representing a Teke chief holding a Bembe sword. The Met Museum goes on to say that when one people's art honors the power symbol of a neighboring culture, this symbolizes peace or an alliance between two groups. Personally, I think it's fascinating to know that a weapon, which would symbolize war in most cultures, in this particular case, can actually serve as an icon for peace instead. One tiny wrinkle I'll point out, though, is that this particular sculpture has its sword in its left hand and not the right hand, which was what was mentioned in the book we discussed earlier. I'm not sure that matters all that much, though, because it could be a completely different sculpture that's being featured in that book. I don't know, because all I got is a snippet view. But anyway, I figured I'd point this out. Now, getting back to how this sword may be related to Teke masks, let's now read the rest of what the Kakalaka Museum had to say about these blades. In connection with the Nkita ritual order, the blades were a typical part of the Nkita equipment. A woman presented this kind of knife to signal to those around her from her liminal seclusion in the rite of passage that she wanted palm wine. According to an oral statement by Billy Morris, the waveform of the knife symbolizes the Nkitan's connection to the spirits of the water. Spirits of the water! Okay, so what I got from the text is that women clearly use these swords a lot for both work and ceremony as far as the Teke culture is concerned. Secondly, the waveform of the knife, I think, refers to the curve at the tip of the blade and probably is intended to look like a tidal wave, if I had to guess. Beyond that, I then decided to look up the Nkita because I was pretty sure it was related to the Teke Kitamu mask. And indeed it is. Now, since I've studied Africa for a long time, I already knew about the Kitamu mask, but when you've been researching a continent for 14 years, you're bound to forget some stuff. And the thing I forgot about this mask is when it's being performed, the dancer is doing cartwheels, which frankly doesn't sound like the kind of dance you'd want to do with a sword in your hand. Plus, while looking through the very few on-site photos of the Kitamu masquerades, I don't see them holding swords. Although, maybe this guy is. It's hard to tell in these old-ass photos, but do you see that bright white line jutting out from his hand? That might, emphasis on might, be the cutting edge of a sword, but then again, sometimes when you're looking for a particular object, suddenly a lot of stuff starts to look like the thing you're looking for, you know what I mean? Eventually, I wound up re-examining that sentence from the book, De Fer et De Fert, and considering what I read on the Kakalaka site, perhaps the subject in that sentence was in fact a woman, so it could have been saying, the Nkita women in their liminal state represent ancestors or spirits. The objects held in their right hand are swords. I think that's a reasonable possibility. Then again, I could just buy a non-English book for over $100 to know for sure. But what do I look like? A guy made of money? Besides, I think I've been able to uncover quite a lot of information about this sword without spending a dime. Wouldn't you agree? That said, if I ever do make a decent income on YouTube, I promise that I will spend some of that money on a ton more books for African research, which would, of course, help to make more videos for all of you. With all that said, being that I can only find a limited amount of info on the Nkita, while on the other hand, thanks to the books I do own, I know with certainty that the Teke sculptures do in fact represent ancestors and spirits, I would say that figure sculptures were the most likely subject of that sentence in the book De Fer et De Fert, despite how rare it is for them to be sculpted with swords. Anyway, we got a lot more swords and a lot more cultures to talk about, so let's keep this show on the road. Our next sword is the Kakalaka. Are you surprised to see this one among the Teke? Well, so was I. We've done a video about the Kakalaka before and how it appears in video games such as Zelda and other games. At that time, I was not aware that the Teke were one of the peoples that made these things. Anyway, I found even more info about the sword. Some of it I'll share with you today, and some of it I'll share with you when we get to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Specifically, I want to tell you some info about this wonky variant of the Kakalaka that splits in the center like a fountain of water. In a book titled Odd and Curious in Traditional Money, it states that the heavier Kakalakas were a symbol of judicial authority and the position of chief, whereas lighter Kakalakas were not only used as a prestige item of chiefs, but also by other important people as well. And unlike most blades, this weapon could be carried by title-holding women who were the principal wife of a powerful man. While we're on the subject of variants, I found this other Teke sword, which might be another variant of the Kakalaka. The Teke also make leaf blades like the ones we discussed in our video about the swords of Gabon, and they even make their own version of this famous sword, often called the double-bladed Ngulu sword. I intend to discuss these sword forms when we get to the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I wanted to show you that they exist here as well to acknowledge the fact that popular sword forms get around. In fact, here's another one from the Lobala people who live in both of the Congos. Another reason I want to show the Teke version is because in this particular one you can see that it has a unique pommel shaped like an extra handle. I imagine it may have been added so that you could hang the sword when it's not in use, but that's just my speculation. Getting back to more Teke-specific weapons, we have this awesome rounded sword, which frankly is my favorite Teke blade. It reminds me of a sword I drew when I was much younger. I remember wanting to make a very unique sword, so I made one with a rounded tip. But seems Africa beat me to the punch, huh? As for details on this sword, well, I haven't been able to learn much, but they seem to be pretty rare and were likely a ceremonial sword. Our last Teke sword is this decorative masterpiece known as the Embelley. Apparently, these things are extremely rare, according to a translation of the good old Tefert. This supreme short sword is the most famous Teke model. It is often referred to as the Royal Teke knife, but I could not find confirmation. That's right, even experts are sometimes unsure about things. If it's alright with all of you, I'd like to throw in my own hypothesis. I think it's possible that Teke leaders themselves may have forged these prestigious items. The basis of my hypothesis comes from something I learned in the book Art of Africa by Jacques Kershak, which states the following in page 566. The Teke often choose a blacksmith as chief, an important person in the community whose profession was passed down from father to son. So you can see where I'm coming from with this idea, right? If your chief is a blacksmith, well, he's going to be smithing something, isn't he? And that something could very likely be swords. Now, believe it or not, the Teke are not the only peoples we're going to be talking about today. So let's now switch gears to talk about the Mabochi. The Mabochi people I decided to try to find a weapon for because they're one of the larger populations of the Congo. And let me tell you something, it's a pain in the ass to research these people because their name, Mabochi, can be spelled in a million different ways. That said, no matter how I type their name into the search engine, the only sword-like weapon I could find is in this image right here. And frankly, I'm not sure this thing is long enough to even be called a sword. It's probably more like a knife. But for whatever reason, I really wanted to figure out what the hell this thing is, so I went ahead and did a shitload of digging. And like usual, I wound up digging my way to the French part of the internet, and while reading about Mabochi's sculpture at the Musée d'Ethnographie Genève, I discovered a sentence that, when translated, read, "An ethnic minority of the Mabochi group occupying northern Congo Brazzaville, the Kwele, live on both sides of the river whose name they bear." And then it immediately dawned on me what the hell I'm looking at in this old photograph. Here is the Kwele dagger. Pretty neat looking, isn't it? And since I took so much time trying to figure out what this thing is, I wound up putting it on our map anyway. But having said that, does the Kwele actually have a full-on sword? Yes, they do. And here is the Kwele sword. Unfortunately, there's some disappointing news I gotta share with you guys, and that is that there's practically zero information about either of these weapons out there. The only book I know of that features these weapons is Beauty Fatale Armes d'Afrique Centrale But whether this book actually contains some substantial cultural information about these weapons, or just the bare minimum info, is anyone's guess. Either way, the word fatality is not in that title for no reason, because this thing will do a fatality to your wallet. It's $300 fucking dollars. And that's for the cheapest one I saw. The most expensive one I saw was almost $600. You could buy a PlayStation 9 for that kind of money. Our next weapon at least has a little bit of info available. This is a Kwele blade. It may look like a throwing knife, but according to the Smithsonian, it is in fact a sword. The museum also asserts that this sword was used for decapitations. What I find particularly interesting is that they referred to the spike in the middle as a beak. I'm not certain if the museum simply chose that word to describe this for the sake of flowery language, but it's possible that they were very purposeful in that word choice because the neighbors of the Kwele, the Kota and Feng in Gabon, have throwing knives that are intended to look like the beaks of a toucan bird. So in my future studies, I may try to learn if the toucan has a significant cultural importance. But for now, let's move on to the Bembe people. Bembe swords are elusive weapons to find. For the longest time, the only academic evidence I could uncover about their existence came from Bembe sculpture. Now I know in the hands of these sculptures, these things just kind of look like small knives, but the Met Museum explains that they represent swords. And of course, much later down the line, I learned what we discussed earlier, which is that the Bembe make Lipay swords, or as the Bembe would call them, kitanasi. Luckily, the sculptures help to enlighten us about the role of the sword in their society, which is why it is important to study many different aspects of culture, because various parts of life have a way of connecting to each other. In Bembe belief, the ancestors are an important source of vital power. These ancestor figure sculptures allow the Bembe to channel the powers of the deceased elders to their descendants. Many of these figures would typically be holding items which could reveal information about their former lives. This example here holds a gourd in one hand, which is a container of medicine, while holding a machete in the other hand, which can symbolize political or military strength. These details suggest that the figure embodies a man who was either a medicine man or a chief, or maybe even both. Now, having said that, all of these weapons and other items that the sculptures held were just icons. Their actual source of power came from magical substances that were hidden away within the statue. Originally, I planned to tell you even more about the Bembe, but I decided to save that for the future. Now let's move on to our last sword of the show. Oompa Akka Doompa Dee Dees, we just cut Wonka at the knees. We'll put him through incarceration and control the means of production. Yes, it's finally time to talk about the blades used by the forest people of Central Africa, more commonly known as pygmies, and specifically the Akka people. Finding an image of a traditional Akka blade was rather difficult because I kept finding images of Akka and other pygmy groups using what appears to be modern machetes. If you look closely at this photo, for example, there are rivets in the handle. Luckily, I found some relevant text in a paper from Cambridge University on African agricultural tools. It states, "The African cutlass, machete, or panga, is essentially a large knife used for cutting undergrowth and woody stems as part of general ground clearance. This is not a typical European tool, so it was presumably designed as an improved version of an existing African tool. The most likely model is the Couture de Culture of the Congo, which was probably remodeled in Europe in the 19th century and re-exported to Africa. So yeah, the Akka, like many other Africans, now use modern machetes, and although it's been redesigned by Europeans, these cutlasses were based on a knife whose cultural origins derived in the Congo. Having said all that, I believe I have found some traditional Akka machete, like this one for example, and besides the types of uses you'd expect, like helping in foraging activities and butchering meat, one particularly noteworthy use for the machete is to chisel one's teeth into sharpened points. Let's now dig a little deeper with some quotes from a paper called Social Learning Among Congo Basin Hunter-Gatherers. 3 fundamental schemas pervade hunter-gatherer life. egalitarianism, autonomy, and sharing. An egalitarian way of thinking means others are respected for what they are, and it is not appropriate to draw attention to oneself or judge others to be better or worse than others. Men and women, young and old, are viewed as relatively equal and have similar access to resources. Respect for an individual's autonomy is also a core cultural value. One does not coerce others, including children. Men and women, young and old, are generally free to do what they want. If an infant wants to play with a machete, she is allowed to do so. A giving or sharing way of thinking also pervades hunter-gatherer life. Hunter-gatherers share 50% to 80% of what is acquired by hunting and gathering. Aka share with everyone in camp every day. Now, I'm sure a lot of you noticed that line about machetes, and we're going to delve deeper into that in a moment, but I wanted to pause in our quotation for a second to acknowledge the fact that they talk a lot about sharing here. And the reason I'm highlighting the whole sharing thing is because sharing is at the root of socialism. So I wasn't just being cheeky when I added that line about controlling the means of production in that Oompa Loompa song. In fact, varying degrees of socialist values have pervaded African societies throughout history, and the Aka peoples are a great example of this. Now let's jump back into that quote, shall we? Parents make small axes, digging sticks, baskets, and spears for infants and young children. These are small-sized artifacts that reflect the size of the infant or child and are not toys. The infants chop, dig, etc., and the parents watch, laugh, make sounds, and sometimes physically take the infant's hand to show them how to use the implement. Parents move the arm of the infant to show her how to dig, or use a knife, or pointed objects, or actions that help the infant to obtain oblique information about a tool or a particular task. So as you can see, Aka children are not just playing with machetes, they are practicing. They're practicing important and practical skills. When you live in a non-industrial and non-agricultural society, you have to grow up quickly because you're going to be expected to help out. Although life for the Aka peoples can be difficult, there is certainly a beauty to it, and I hope I helped you to be able to see that. And it's worth noting that if industrialized countries embraced the sharing spirit of the Aka peoples, we would all be a lot better off.